This is a Buddhist temple, and we are a Jōdo Shinshū sect of Buddhism, which is Mahayana. And we're a Japanese sect of Buddhism, and the main thing we try to teach is gratitude. And it centers on Amida Buddha, who's different than Shakyamuni Buddha. Shakyamuni Buddha is a historical Buddha, whereas Amida Buddha is the Buddha of infinite light in life. It represents compassion and wisdom. So for us as Jōdo Shinshū, it's to realize that we're embraced in this great compassion at all times. And so all our services are centered on trying to express gratitude for that what we're receiving. We don't center on meditation, which is what people usually associate with Buddhism, but Jōdo Shinshū was a form of Buddhism that was for the peasants in Japan. That's why it became so large. It's the largest sect of Buddhism in Japan because peasants don't have time to meditate. So it was a very simple form of Buddhism for the common person. Hinduism is probably the religion that the historical Buddha Siddhartha Gautama was part of. And one of his, I believe, the purposes of his teaching, turning of the wheels, what we call it, was to break with the caste system that is prevalent in Hinduism. And the easiest way to explain this break is within Hinduism, they talk about a soul that's unchanging from life to life to life. That's their rationale for you're born into a certain caste, and you don't move out of that. Whereas Buddha said that a person shouldn't be judged by their birth. And so the soul concept is called Atman. In Buddhism, it's called Anatman, which means no soul or no permanent soul that moves from life to life, because one of the basic teachings is that all things are constantly changing. So within Buddhism, I'd like to think that this non-discrimination is a basic part of the teaching, right? Which is some of the teachings in like karma. It's basically the same if you look at the definition of karma in Hinduism and Buddhism. But this idea of unchanging soul is, I would say, the biggest difference between the two. "2,600 years ago, there was a person by the name of Siddhartha Gautama who was born into a noble family. And when he was born, these are all legends, by the way. One thing that I like people to understand is in Buddhism, whether or not this is historically true is secondary. Okay, it's the teachings that's important. But the story of Siddhartha is that he was born into this noble family. There was, a prediction that this child to be born would either be a great ruler of this world or become the Buddha, the enlightened one. His father, of course, since it's a patrilineage type thing where his son would follow the father, wanted him to become the ruler of the world rather than the Buddha. So he sheltered him, but then eventually this young man still had all these questions. So he left to search for the truth. And after all these various types of practices, eventually he became the Buddha. And Buddha isn't one person. Buddha is a title, which means enlightened one, someone who has awakened to the truth. And so from that time, Buddha taught, we call him Shakyamuni Buddha, the teacher of the Shakya clan where he came from. But he taught and it grew, then it followed the Silk Road, and it moved through like Afghanistan, China, Tibet, Japan, and came here to the US about over 100 years ago now. So that's the origins. But wherever Buddhism went, all Buddhists have some basic teachings that are very similar, like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. But Buddhism has adapted culturally. So wherever it goes, it has taken on aspects of the culture it's in and develops in that way. So there's Japanese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. I would say, some people say it's here now, but I would say in 100, 200 years, there'll be an American form of Buddhism. Nirvana is basically enlightenment. The word itself means extinction or extinguishing. And some people have this idea that when we say extinguishing, it's like nihilism, there's nothing, right? Whereas when we're talking about extinguishing, it's extinguishing of the ego self, right? So someone who is enlightened is able to see the other person and all things as not separate from themselves, right? So it's a very difficult thing to do, to not have ego, but that's basically what nirvana is. And nirvana is enlightenment, which is the ultimate truth, which is a dynamic thing that is always around us, right? And as we extinguish ourself, the ego, we become more in touch with this nirvana, right? So in various sects of Buddhism, they talk about it in different ways. In Zen, they will talk about kensho or satori, which are these momentary illuminations of nirvana. They touch it, but it's not constant because we have this ego. So for my sect of Buddhism, we believe that you don't attain enlightenment or nirvana till after death, because that's when your ego is fully extinguished. But it's not saying it's not possible, because we believe that this person by the name of Siddhartha Gautama did do it. Yes, but the last one we say was Siddhartha Gautama, okay, and that's 2,600 years ago. And according to the sutras, which are the teachings, the words of the Buddha, the next Buddha is called Maitreya. And he or she will come, and Buddhism will, as all things change, Buddhism will disappear too. And then this new Buddha will talk about the truth again. And if you look up the word Maitreya, which is the word for the future Buddha, the etymology is connected to the word Messiah, which I always thought was quite interesting.
That's fascinating.
A real easy way to explain it is just this past week we held on today is the equinox, right? That's called Ohigan, which literally means other shore. And so we talk about this shore and the other shore, which we call the Pure Land, the land of enlightenment. In between is called samsara, the ocean of birth and death. And it's to strive to reach this world of enlightenment. So it's to understand this. For us in Jōdo Shinshū, we believe that we can't make it across on our own. So we need to rely upon something greater than ourselves, and this is what we call Amida Buddha, the Buddha of infinite light and life, which is a cosmic Buddha. In Buddhism, there are three bodies of the Buddha. There's ultimate reality, and there's these cosmic Buddhas that manifest in our terms in things such as compassion and wisdom. Then there's the historical Buddha, which is Shakyamuni. Right, so our goal is to reach that land on the other shore. And Ohigan is a time that Japanese Buddhists developed to contemplate that idea of going to the other shore. And it's done twice a year on Ohigan, which is on the spring and fall equinox. Well, actually, when we use the boat analogy, this is actually a Shin Buddhist concept of Amida Buddha is like that boat. The vow of Amida is to take us across to the other shore, right? Because we don't believe that we can swim across this ocean of birth and death on our own, right? Whereas maybe some other schools of Buddhism, such as Theravada, it's through practice that you're able to gain enlightenment. If you compare it to Christianity, it's the difference between works and grace. Some schools of Christianity talk about that you are saved by grace. Some say it's works. I say it's very similar in Buddhism in the fact that Jōdo Shinshū Buddhism believes that it's pure grace. Everybody will be drawn into nirvana or enlightenment, right? Through the grace of this, what we call Amida Buddha. One thing about Buddhism, it kind of goes to your question about before you lived or after you die. It's really not a big question for us as Buddhists. The fact is you're here right now. So you better figure out what you want to do right now. What is the significance of this wondrous life that you have been given? Because there's all these causes and conditions that have allowed you to be born. In Buddhism, we think that the best way I describe it is the entire universe has worked just so you could be born, because everything had to hit the exact right point. Your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother and father had to meet, and everything had to work out for them to be together. Then all these causes and conditions had to work just so that you could be born. So you've been given this great gift. What are you going to do with it is the big question. Reincarnation, I would say that within historical Buddhism, when you look at the time of Siddhartha Gautama, they didn't even question the fact that there was reincarnation. They believed that you are born again and again and again. But the way I view it within my school of Buddhism is that reincarnation is more about how we are born moment to moment to moment in these. They've talked about the realms of existence, 6 realms of existence, which is hell, the world of fighting spirits, animals, all these various realms. These are realms that we are constantly being reborn into. From the me I am now is not the me that I was yesterday. We're constantly changing. So we're constantly being reborn that way. As far as after I die, I don't know. I really don't know. Most people haven't died to come back to tell us what happened. So I can't tell you definitively what happens. I can tell you my experience of death, but I don't think it's that important, the idea of reincarnation. What happens to me after I believe I'm embraced in compassion right now? Why would it disappear when I'm dead? My favorite example on this idea of reincarnation, what happens after you die, is one time the State Department brought 5 or 6 imams from Egypt and Africa here to the temple. I don't know why the State Department does it in Utah, but they bring these people and they go to various religious places in Utah. And the only common language they had was French. And they're dressed in their native garb. To me, it made me think of the nativity scene, the creche, how the 3 wise men are dressed, and they're sitting here. And I let them ask me any questions, and they says, what happens after you die? That was one of the first questions they asked. And I said that I believe that there's this infinite love and compassion that embraces me at this moment. And I call this Buddha. I call this enlightenment. For me, I call it Amida Buddha. And I says, I think you call it God or agape or something to that in that vein. And I said, when I die, it's just one split second. And I said, why would God or this compassion me abandon me when I might need it the most? And so I said, I don't worry about dying because I believe that this great compassion will be there for me. And the thing that why these guys, the translators are going, they're saying that's very wise. And so I went and told my wife, so today I had the wise men come to my temple and they said that I was wise. The answer to them. So I think that's a pretty good answer if they agree with it too. Karma is often misunderstood. Like I said, karma itself within Hindu and Buddhism is the same because karma just means action, right? So, or act, it's a noun, right? It's just this act at this moment. People are usually interpreting karma as the verb of the action and the effect and effect and effect, whereas karma itself is just the action itself at that moment. And that has repercussions from the past, and it has effects into the future. And that's what people usually interpret as karma. But karma itself just means the act at this moment. That, I've discussed this often with people, and it depends on how you define a God when you're talking about theistic. Because if you say it's an anthropomorphic creator type God who judges you, I would say, no, it is not theistic. But I also have to say, I don't know for sure. And I think that if I would say, I know there's some Buddhists who say we're atheists. I don't believe that because how can we know for sure? So if you're putting us into a category, I would say it's agnostic. I don't think God would be someone who looks like me, right? And then I've looked and looked to see where this quote came, but someplace I heard someone say that, why would I want to believe in a God that I could fully understand? God is much more than something I can understand. So this whole concept of God to me is much more than I could fit into my little mind. Right? So I just trust that there is this wisdom and compassion in the universe that embraces all of us. I don't know what it looks like. I can't define it in human terms, but I have found in my life that there's something there. Like I explained to my Sunday school, Dharma school kids, I'm not even good at math. What makes me think I can understand the entire truth of the universe, right? So I have to trust in what I do know. And I do know that I am a human being with incredible weaknesses and frailties. We call this bonno klesha, greed, anger, and ignorance. And despite myself, the universe seems to be supporting me. And if I used it just as a mathematical thing, is I put in this much, this is what I get out, it's not equal. I receive so much more than I've given, so that has to come from someplace. If you look at it historically, there were differences. The first, during the time of Siddhartha Gautama, I always thought this was an interesting story, whether or not it's true. They said that the person who raised him, because his mother died right after his birth, so he was raised by his aunt. After he became enlightened and became the Buddha, his aunt, along with 500 women, came to his gathering and said, we want to be a part of this. And he said, no. He said, because it will cause, because it was the celibate model, where if the women and men were together, they're not going to be able to practice in a certain way. So he said, no, I think it's 3 times. And then his main attendant, who was also a relative of his, said, this is your mother asking this. So he goes, okay, they can become a part of the Sangha, but it would be a separate group called nuns, bhikkhunis. So there would be a group for women and a group for men. But as Mahayana developed, things began to change. And then if you look at even the doctrinal changes that have happened within my school of Buddhism, there's no difference between men, women, gay, straight. Anyone can become a priest. Right? The only one that they follow with a patrilineal line is who we call the Gomonshu, because it's a historical link to the founder of our school of Buddhism by the name of Shinran Shonin. So that has followed from father to son for 20-something generations now. But that's the only one that they have just as a male. The priests themselves, there's no difference between the two. It's total inclusion. As far as the gay and straight, there is no discrimination that way. One of the few, for many years, I was the chairperson for the priests within here in the US. And we don't make very many comments on social issues, except we did make a statement, a resolution for gay marriage, because we've had, even though it wasn't legal, we did gay marriages for years and years and years, because we don't think that there's anything wrong with that, right? Compared to maybe some of the Christian sects that have certain doctrinal things that exclude it. Within Jōdo Shinshū, there's no difference between. The whole idea of sex is what was the problem with the historical Buddha. He says sex causes problem. He didn't say whether it's heterosexual or homosexual. It's sex causes these desires, right? And he didn't go into gender as far as that goes. Buddhism first came, I would say, officially at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. And that's when the first Buddhists came to the United States. But there had been a movement before with the how do you say it? Like Madame Blavatsky, Olcott, these people who are experimenting and learning about Eastern philosophies. So there had been some interest, but actually at the World Parliament, there were Buddhists from my sect of Buddhism, Theravada, Eastern traditions who came to this World Parliament, and that's what's created the interest. And so in 1898 or so, my school of Buddhism sent the first priests here. But what I thought was interesting, it was a very Japanese organization. But when World War II broke out and the Japanese were sent to these camps, it changed. So it was here in Utah, in the Topaz concentration camp, where the Buddhist Churches of America became the Buddhist Churches of America. Before it was a Japanese name. It changed the name Buddhist Churches of America. These bylaws were written very Western. That's when we became churches, not temples. They used the word ministers, not priests, because it didn't sound alien. And this happened in the camps here in Utah. So we had this temple here, but because we're in Utah, Utah was a free zone. So we were still here. But all these representatives from camps, such as Minidoka towards Idaho, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz, they got these releases to come to this meeting in Topaz, which is in Delta, Utah, to form this Buddhist Churches of America. So I thought that was an interesting part of history of Buddhism here in Utah. Well, my term, the term they use in Japan is I'm what's called kai kyoshi, which means I'm a teacher of Buddhism, but the literal translation of the words kaikyo mean I am a tool of the Buddha. So in some way it's a missionary, but we don't proselytize in Buddhism. Buddhism doesn't have proselytizing because we don't say we're the one true way. So we will open temples. So these priests come from Japan and open temples, usually because there were already Buddhists in the area who wanted priests to do rituals or whatever. And then it's open to whoever wants to come. Just like here. We don't proselytize. That's why I thought it was very interesting a few years ago when the Dalai Lama first came to Utah. He was asked at the University of Utah in this discussion, I think it was university, he asked, what do you think of missionaries? And he's in Utah. And he says, I don't care too much for them. And I thought, wow, he said that here in Utah. And he says, because I don't believe there's one way. And so who is one religion to go to another person's country and culture and say, we are better than you are? He says there's beauty in all these forms of religion. So my title could be interpreted as like a missionary, but it's more of someone who's trying to transmit the Dharma, the teachings. So I'm not spiritually different than someone who's lay. My rank or my title comes from my training. Having been born and raised here in Utah, where I grew up right in the center of Salt Lake, there is a LDS ward across the street from my house. It's funny, right in my backyard was the seminary for South High School, where I grew up. And so I took part in all the LDS activities. I went to primary, I went to Boy Scouts, I went to Cub Scouts, played basketball, softball, all these things. And my father was very open-minded. He told me from a young age that he wants me to come to the Buddhist temple on Sundays. But he says, you're not a Buddhist till you decide that you're a Buddhist. He says, and I want you to decide for yourself. So I went to the church and everything, and it just didn't fit. And so I began to study many different religions. And probably one of the last places I looked again was my own religion. And then as I was older, it made sense. I was more in college when these questions and things developed, and I was active at the University of Utah in student government, and I was planning to go to law school. And then a very good friend of mine at the time, his name was Pete Suazo. He was a senator here in Utah at one time. He passed away, but we were good friends at that time. And he said, we should go into politics here in Utah. And he goes, it'd be great if you became ordained. Because he knew I had that thought in myself. And so rather than go to law school, because everyone who's in student government at the University of Utah usually thinks, I'm going to go to law school. And I thought, I don't get along that great with these people right now. I don't want to go to law school for 3 more years with them. So I decided, well, maybe I'll study Buddhism for a while. So I went to get my master's in Buddhist studies. And then I met a number of people and teachers who told me to ask myself, what is important in my life, right? Where has my sense of self come from? And they says, are you really going to make a difference as a lawyer? At that time they said, there are so many third-generation Japanese Americans who are lawyers. And they're quite honest. They said, you'll become a lawyer with these great ideals, but then you'll probably sell out to go for the money. So how much effect will you have? And they said, if you became a priest, we don't have very many people who are willing to become priests. Maybe you could give back to the community that has made you who you are. So it was at that time that I got my master's, then went to Japan to study, and was ordained, and I ended up back here in Salt Lake where I came from. the best thing is when you're, I think, a minister of any religion, a clergy, you take part in the most significant aspects of people's lives. You became involved and can have an effect when people are at their saddest, like funerals, deaths, and also at weddings, these very happy celebrations. I don't think there's very many livelihoods that you could do that, you know, and it allows you to become the best that you can be. I think that I'm not a friendly, nice guy when I think about myself because of these defenses I put up as I grew up. I had to become tough, I had to become a man, you know, I had to be a certain way. But when I became a priest, I began to touch onto what was really important to me. And it kind of softened me, so to speak, so I could become involved with other people at a very emotional level. And I find that very satisfying. Probably the worst thing, which I do a lot, especially since I'm so much in the national administration, board meetings. That's probably the worst part of being a priest. Temple board meetings, national board meetings, all these various board meetings. That's probably the worst part. Buddhism, I think, is different than maybe some other types of religion, is because we don't say that we are the one way. In Buddhism, there's a saying that there's 84,000 ways to enlightenment, which means there's an infinite number of ways to develop and find your own spiritual nature. We're just one. And so what's important for a human being is they just find that path that fits them, because in this world, in the current society, we have a tendency to kind of neglect our spiritual development, which is probably the most important part of being a human being. Like my own children, I tell my daughters, if you're Buddhist, that's great. But if you're not, that's great too, if you find a way. What I want for you is that you find something that you can turn to that talks to you about very important aspects of your life. It's something that I'm not always going to be around to talk as a father, but if you find your spiritual self, you'll always be embraced. It's almost like we're always together in that way. So Buddhism emphasizes that, finding your spiritual path that's right for you, right? And Buddhism might not be the way, but when I speak, I'm saying it's the way that works for me. So that's why I talk about it in a very personal sense, a very subjective sense. Personally, I'm quite liberal in my politics, and I worry about our political climate is becoming a thing where it's okay to call people names. You know, it's okay to say them and us. And to me, that's just not right in any way I look at it, you know. Everything that I have been taught as an American seems to be falling to the wayside with, you know, it's okay to bully people. It's okay to, you know, for myself as a Japanese American, how can I allow the things that happen to my community seem to be coming up again? You know, history repeating itself. And I think it's because we are forgetting that spiritual part of ourselves, you know? It's just becoming so material, what I can get out of it, rather than what we can do together, you know? So I know that's kind of political, and so I have to be very careful, as maybe that's a hard thing that I do as a minister, is I can't be too subjective on those things, because my temple is a place where those who agree with me politically and don't agree with me politically are welcome. Both sides are welcome. So I cannot, representing, the Dharma, so to speak, can't say you're right, you're wrong, right? So maybe that's the hardest part rather than just board meetings. When all these things against the Muslim Americans came up, for us it was like deja vu, it's happening again, right? And now the violence that are happening around the world, not just in the US, but against religious groups, against different races, that's very troublesome to me. And it's like we have to start speaking like you're doing with this film about how we're all in it together. Whether we have different political views, that's one thing, but violence and hatred is never going to solve it. And I remember the ramifications growing up, how Japanese were discriminated against, right? And so our church, our temples are a good example of that. People say, how come we don't know about Shinshū, Shin Buddhism, right? It's because this was kind of like a fortress for the Japanese American community. We weren't just a spiritual sanctuary, we're a community sanctuary. So most all the temples you would go to within my group will have a gym because they're a community gathering, but it felt safe for the Japanese here. But that has really broken down quite a bit now. So we are doing things more in the community and welcoming, I think. Although it's part of the doctrine, just because we're humans, it was very Japanese and Japanese American, but that's changing.